On the 17th of May, in 1943, within the walls of U-Boat Command Headquarters, located in the French town of Courneval, a senior German naval officer named Kapitän Sauce Eberhard Gott found himself examining photographs and intelligence reports that had recently arrived concerning American naval construction efforts. The documents spread before him detailed the production of what the Americans were calling escort carriers, and as he studied the images through his monocle, which caught and reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, Gott's expression transformed into one of barely disguised scorn. The photograph that particularly captured his attention depicted a vessel designated as USS Bogue, a ship that had already been operating in the Atlantic for approximately 8 months, but had only recently come to the attention of German intelligence analysts. What Gott saw in that photograph struck him as so absurd, so fundamentally inadequate, that he actually released an audible laugh. He passed the photograph across his desk to Contra-Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg, who examined the image with an expression mirroring Gott's contempt. Both officers saw the same thing in that photograph, what appeared to be nothing more than a merchant vessel that had been hastily modified with a flight deck, a vessel so diminutive, so obviously improvised and desperate in its conception, that it seemed to represent American weakness rather than strength. That evening, as Gott made his entries in the official war diary, he recorded his assessment with confidence that would later prove tragically misplaced. He wrote that the Americans had resorted to constructing aircraft carriers from ordinary merchant ships, creating what he characterized as floating crates equipped with merely a handful of aircraft that could not possibly pose any meaningful threat to the sophisticated wolfpack tactics employed by German submarine forces. These vessels, in Gott's professional opinion, lacked everything that made a proper warship effective. They had none of the speed characteristic of fleet carriers, none of the protective armor that distinguished true warships, none of the elegant design principles that defined proper naval architecture. To Gott's trained eye, these escort carriers represented nothing more than desperation given physical form in steel and wood. What neither Gott nor Friedeberg could possibly understand as they examined those photographs with such dismissive contempt was that they were actually looking at the very instrument that would bring about their own destruction and the complete collapse of Germany's submarine warfare campaign. Within a span of merely 18 months from that afternoon in May 1943, these diminutive escort carriers that seemed so laughable would accomplish something that German naval strategists had declared impossible. They would transform the entire character of the Battle of the Atlantic, taking what had been a significant German advantage and converting it into an Allied victory so overwhelming, so complete in its totality, that U-boat crews would begin referring to their operational missions not as combat patrols, but as suicide runs. The transformation that was about to unfold was already being written in the massive American shipyards, where an industrialist named Henry Kaiser had developed production techniques that allowed his workers to manufacture escort carriers at a rate faster than Germany could construct submarines. The psychological journey that German naval officers would undertake, moving from contempt to terror, would not unfold gradually over years, but would instead compress into mere months, as these officers discovered through bitter experience that American industrial and production logic had once again exceeded anything their imagination had prepared them to encounter. The true genesis of this story actually reaches back to the 8th of June in 1941, a full 18 months before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor would bring America formally into the war. On that date, President Franklin Roosevelt recognized something that many of his own admirals initially dismissed as an impossible fantasy. America needed aircraft carriers, and not just dozens of them, but hundreds of them, to protect the merchant convoys that would be essential to keeping Britain supplied and in the fight. However, conventional fleet carriers presented an insurmountable problem. Each one required approximately 3 years to construct from keel, laying to commissioning, and each one cost the monetary equivalent of 10 destroyer escorts. Roosevelt's proposed solution seemed absurd to traditionally minded naval thinkers on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. His plan called for converting merchant ships into carriers, constructing them on commercial shipbuilding production lines using techniques borrowed from industrial manufacturing. The resulting vessels would admittedly be slow, vulnerable to attack, and limited in their capabilities, but they would be produced in such overwhelming quantities that their individual weaknesses would become strategically irrelevant. Captain Friedrich Rouge, who served as a naval liaison officer to the German High Command, reviewed the initial American specifications for these escort carriers in the early months of 1942, with what can only be described as professional incredulity, bordering on disbelief. The specifications indicated maximum speeds of merely 18 knots, barely faster than a surfaced submarine running on diesel engines. Some models would feature wooden flight decks rather than armoured steel. The hull construction would use commercial-grade steel instead of military armour plating. The propulsion systems relied on single screws that would be extremely vulnerable to torpedo damage. After reviewing these specifications, Rouge prepared an analysis for Admiral Raeder, in which he wrote that the Americans appeared to be fundamentally confusing the concept of quantity with the entirely separate principle of quality. These vessels, in Rouge's professional assessment, were maritime disasters simply waiting to occur. He confidently predicted that any properly trained U-boat commander would feast upon these slow, vulnerable ships like a predator among defenseless prey. The confidence that permeated the German naval establishment rested upon foundations that seemed entirely solid at the time. Their U-boat force had achieved remarkable success, having sunk 1,299 Allied ships with a combined tonnage of 6,266,000 tons during the period between September 1939 and December 1942. The Wolfpack tactics that had been developed and refined by Admiral Karl Dönitz had effectively transformed the North Atlantic into what Winston Churchill himself called the only thing that truly frightened him throughout the entire war. U-boats operated with what seemed like near impunity, surfacing during nighttime hours to pursue convoys with diesel engines that provided them with 17 knots of surface speed, allowing them to overtake and position themselves ahead of merchant convoys. Aircraft represented the greatest threat to submarine operations, but land-based patrol planes could not reach what was known as the Mid-Atlantic Gap, that deadly expanse of ocean beyond the range of aircraft based in either Iceland, Britain, Canada, or the United States, where U-boats could congregate and systematically slaughter merchant ships with minimal interference. Oberleutnant zur See Herbert Werner, commanding the submarine designated U-230, made an entry in his war diary on the 3rd of March in 1943 that documented his assessment of American escort carriers following his first encounter with one near a convoy designated SC-121. Werner recorded that he had sighted what appeared to be a merchant vessel that had aircraft positioned on its deck, a ship too slow to represent a serious threat and too small to carry what he would consider a meaningful air group. He maintained surveillance of this curious vessel for approximately 2 hours, during which time he observed aircraft operations that appeared amateurish, with visible difficulties evident whenever wind conditions became challenging. Werner reported back to BDU, the U-boat command headquarters, that American desperation had apparently reached the point where they were now sending merchant ships equipped with planes into combat zones. Werner's contemptuous assessment reflected the standard German naval doctrine of the time, a doctrine that completely failed to grasp 3 critical factors that would prove decisive. The first factor that German naval thinking failed to comprehend was that these escort carriers did not need to be fast in any absolute sense because they travelled as part of convoys that moved at speeds of only 8 to 10 knots, meaning an 18-knot carrier could easily keep station. The second factor was that these carriers did not need to embark large air groups because their aircraft did not need to sink submarines. They only needed to force those U-boats to submerge, which reduced their underwater speed from 17 knots to merely 7 knots, making it impossible for them to maintain position ahead of convoys for attack runs. The third factor, and ultimately the most critically important one, was that the Americans intended to build so many of these carriers that eventually the entire Atlantic Ocean would fall within the coverage area of carrier-based aircraft, eliminating the Mid-Atlantic Gap entirely. The production statistics that would ultimately doom the U-boat force as an effective weapon were already accumulating by the spring of 1943, though German intelligence services grossly underestimated the true scale of American shipbuilding efforts. At Henry Kaiser's shipyard facility in Vancouver, Washington, production time for a Casablanca-class escort carrier had been systematically reduced from an initial 6 months down to merely 10 weeks through the application of innovative techniques. By standardizing components and applying assembly line methodologies learned from automobile manufacturers, Kaiser's workforce could launch a newly completed escort carrier every single week by the summer of 1943. German intelligence analysts estimated that American escort carrier production was perhaps 1 vessel per month, which already seemed impressive. The actual reality was closer to 1 completed carrier every 5 days during peak production periods, a rate that would have seemed absolutely impossible to naval architects trained in traditional shipbuilding methods. Captain Lieutenant Peter Creamer, who commanded the submarine U-333, experienced what can be described as the first genuine glimpse of what mass-produced naval aviation truly meant on the 23rd of April in 1943. His boat had been running on the surface approximately 650 miles southwest of Ireland, well within the protective mid-Atlantic gap that had been considered safe from aircraft attack. When the lookout's cry sent the crew scrambling to action stations, Creamer's initial reaction was one of confusion rather than alarm. No land-based aircraft could possibly reach this position given the distances involved. Then he saw them with his own eyes, 2 Avenger torpedo bombers approaching from the northeast, where no carrier should have been operating. His war diary captured the genuine confusion of that moment. He wrote that aircraft had appeared at what should be an impossible range from any land base. These must be operating from a fleet carrier, he reasoned, but no fleet carrier had been reported in the operational area. He ordered an immediate crash dive as the aircraft closed in. Depth charges detonated close enough to his hull to cause concern. His submarine sustained minor damage from the concussion. When he finally surfaced approximately 2 hours later, expecting to find clear seas, he instead discovered the convoy accompanied by what was clearly a converted merchant vessel that was actively launching aircraft. His diary entry ended with a question that would be asked repeatedly in the coming months. How many of these ships do the Americans actually have? The answer to Creamer's increasingly desperate question would have completely shattered German naval morale had it been known at the time. By May of 1943, the United States Navy had formally commissioned 11 escort carriers, with an additional 40 vessels already under various stages of construction in American shipyards. Each carrier operated between 24 and 30 aircraft of various types. The pilots flying these aircraft were mostly reservists, men who had been civilians engaged in ordinary occupations merely 2 years earlier, trained in abbreviated programs that horrified traditional naval aviators who had spent years learning their craft. Yet these amateur pilots, flying from what were essentially merchant ship carriers, were about to accomplish something that the Kriegsmarine had confidently declared to be impossible. They were going to achieve the complete suppression of the U-boat threat throughout the Atlantic Ocean. Rear Admiral Julius Führer, while reviewing German naval intelligence reports during June of 1943, began noting the increasing frequency with which U-boat commanders reported encounters with carrier-based aircraft in areas that had previously been considered safe operational zones. His analysis, which was later found among captured documents after the war's conclusion, revealed a growing concern that was beginning to penetrate the confidence of German naval leadership. Führer wrote that American escort carriers were now being reported in the North Atlantic, the South Atlantic, and in the approaches to the Mediterranean Sea. Intelligence reports suggested that at least 20 of these vessels were operational, though this number seemed almost impossible to credit. If this intelligence was accurate, Führer noted, this represented a fundamental alteration in the capability of Allied convoy protection. He recommended an immediate and comprehensive reassessment of Wolfpack tactics in light of this development. The reassessment that Führer recommended came too late to make any meaningful difference. USS Bogue and her escorting destroyers had already begun what U-boat crews would later refer to with grim humour as the extended Black May period, named after the catastrophic losses U-boats had suffered in May 1943. On the 22nd of May in 1943, Bogue's aircraft spotted the submarine U-569 running on the surface, attempting to transit through what its commander had believed to be a safe area. The submarine immediately executed a crash dive upon sighting the aircraft, but the Avenger that had spotted it marked the submarine's last known position with a smoke float that remained visible on the surface. What followed was 4 hours of relentless, coordinated attacks that gave the submarine no opportunity to escape or evade. U-569's commander, Kapitän zur See Hans-Peter Hinch, eventually surfaced his dying boat just long enough to transmit a final radio message back to U-boat command headquarters. The message reported that his submarine was under continuous air attack, that carrier aircraft were maintaining contact despite all his evasion attempts, that no escape appeared possible, and that he was therefore scuttling his vessel to prevent capture. Admiral Dönitz himself personally reviewed this message when it arrived at headquarters. His initial reaction was to suspect some form of British deception, perhaps an attempt to make German commanders believe that carrier coverage existed where it did not. Only when 2 additional boats reported experiencing similar patterns of continuous air attack did the reality begin to penetrate the consciousness of German naval leadership. Continuous air attack in the mid-Atlantic had been operationally impossible according to all established doctrine, yet experienced commanders with proven records were reporting exactly that phenomenon occurring with increasing frequency. Kapitänleutnant Klaus Rudloff, commanding U-709, encountered aircraft from USS Corps on the 24th of June in 1943. His subsequent report revealed with stark clarity the tactical revolution that was unfolding across the Atlantic. He reported being attacked by carrier-based aircraft approximately 700 miles from the nearest land base, forced to remain submerged for 14 continuous hours as aircraft maintained contact overhead, his battery power completely exhausted by running submerged for so long. When he finally surfaced during nighttime hours to recharge his batteries, believing darkness would provide protection, he was immediately detected by aircraft that appeared to possess some form of detection equipment capable of locating submarines in complete darkness. The aircraft appeared to have unlimited persistence, remaining on station far longer than their fuel capacity should have allowed. Rudloff's report ended with a request for instructions on how to deal with continuous air coverage in areas that were supposed to be beyond aircraft range. There were no instructions that could be provided because German naval doctrine had never contemplated, never planned for, never developed tactics to counter continuous air coverage in mid-ocean areas. The escort carriers operated in what were called hunter-killer groups, each carrier working in coordination with 3 to 4 destroyer escorts. Each escort carrier operating in this configuration could maintain surveillance from dawn to dusk over a radius of approximately 100 miles. When multiple escort carriers operated together in coordinated groups, they created overlapping zones of coverage that made surface operations absolutely suicidal for any U-boat unfortunate enough to be caught within that zone. The technical capabilities that these American escort carriers possessed exceeded German intelligence estimates by significant margins. Each vessel of the Casablanca class displaced 7,800 tons fully loaded and measured 512 feet in length. The flight deck could safely handle aircraft weighing 20,000 pounds, landing at speeds of 80 miles per hour. The hangar deck below the flight deck could accommodate 28 aircraft with complete maintenance facilities for repairs and service. Ammunition magazines held 500,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, along with depth charges, bombs, and torpedoes sufficient to support 2 weeks of continuous combat operations without resupply. Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, recognized as one of Germany's most highly decorated U-boat commanders, encountered this reality directly on the 13th of July in 1943, when his submarine U-201 was caught running on the surface by aircraft operating from USS Corps. His post-action report revealed the profound shock that experienced commanders were experiencing. He reported that aircraft had appeared without any warning whatsoever, providing no time for a proper crash dive procedure. He had gone deep immediately, remaining at maximum operational depth. He heard multiple depth charge explosions, some disturbingly close to his hull. He remained at maximum depth for 6 continuous hours before finally risking a surfacing. When he did surface after darkness had fallen, his submarine was immediately illuminated by aircraft using powerful lights. This pattern repeated itself 3 separate times during that night. The aircraft seemed to know precisely where his submarine would surface, no matter what evasive maneuvers he attempted. What Schnee could not have known, what no German commander understood at that time, was that Korps aircraft carried ASV Mark III radar systems capable of detecting a surfaced submarine at ranges up to 15 miles, even in complete darkness. This radar equipment, when combined with powerful ley lights for illumination and newly developed acoustic homing torpedoes, meant that darkness no longer provided any protection whatsoever for U-boats. German submarine crews had always relied upon night surface operations to recharge their batteries and make speed to reach attack positions ahead of convoys. Now, every moment spent on the surface, regardless of whether it was day or night, invited death from above. The production miracle that was enabling this transformation of naval warfare defied German comprehension and contradicted everything they understood about naval construction. Kaiser Shipbuilding produced its 50th escort carrier, USS Casablanca, in November of 1943, just 18 months after laying the first keel of the class. This particular ship was constructed in 101 days from initial keel laying to final commissioning and delivery to the Navy. Every single component was standardized across the class. Parts manufactured in 267 different factories spread across 32 different states arrived at the shipyard, according to precise schedules that kept production flowing without interruption. Assembly work proceeded continuously, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week, without pause. German intelligence officer Fregattenkapitän Hans Mechel, while analyzing American shipbuilding capacity in December of 1943, wrote a comprehensive report that Admiral Dönitz initially rejected as defeatist propaganda. Mechel's report stated that American escort carrier production appeared to exceed 1 complete unit weekly, which seemed impossible. At this rate, Mechel calculated, by mid-1944 the Americans would possess over 100 such vessels. Each carrier, Mechel noted, effectively negated the combat effectiveness of 3 to 5 U-boats through the coverage area it controlled. Projections based on these numbers indicated that the U-boat force would be completely neutralized as an effective weapon within 12 months. By January of 1944, American escort carriers had moved beyond simply defending convoys reactively. They were now actively hunting U-boats across the Atlantic. Hunter-killer groups built around escort carriers prowled vast areas of ocean, using intelligence derived from ultra-intercepts of German communications to locate U-boat patrol lines before they could intercept convoys. The fundamental relationship had reversed completely. The hunters had become the hunted, and German submarines increasingly found themselves trapped in an environment that grew more deadly with each passing week. U-boat ace Kapitänleutnant Werner Henke, commanding U-515 and holder of some of the highest decorations Germany could bestow, experienced this complete reversal of fortunes on the 9th of April in 1944. Operating north of the Azores Islands in what should have been a relatively safe patrol area, U-515 was located by aircraft operating from USS Guadalcanal. Henke, who wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and who had successfully sunk 26 ships totaling over 100,000 tons during his career, found himself absolutely helpless against the coordinated air and surface attack that developed. His final radio message conveyed a sense of unprecedented desperation that would have been unthinkable from such an experienced commander just a year earlier. He reported being under attack by multiple aircraft simultaneously, unable to remain surfaced without being bombed, unable to escape while submerged due to depth charges, battery power failing from extended submergence, chlorine gas developing inside the boat from damaged batteries, and destroyers bearing down on his position. The message ended with a single word: the time has come. The escort carrier Guadalcanal and her accompanying hunter-killer group had truly revolutionized anti-submarine warfare in ways that traditional naval strategists had not anticipated. Operating independently of any convoy, freed from the defensive mission of protection, they could pursue individual U-boat contacts for days if necessary. During this particular patrol alone, Guadalcanal's hunter-killer group would successfully sink 3 U-boats and inflict serious damage on 2 others. The carrier's aircraft flew an astounding 2,484 hours during a 30-day patrol period. German submarines that had once stalked Allied shipping lanes with confidence now cowered beneath the waves, terrified to surface even for brief periods. The technical superiority of American production methods extended well beyond mere numbers of hulls produced. Each escort carrier incorporated lessons that had been learned from operations of previous vessels in the class. The Casablanca-class ships that were constructed in late 1943 featured improved radar systems compared to earlier vessels, better communication systems that allowed for more effective coordination, stronger flight decks that could handle heavier aircraft and rougher seas, and enhanced crew habitability features that improved morale and efficiency. German observers who had expected American mass production techniques to inevitably result in inferior quality discovered precisely the opposite. The standardization and continuous improvement processes actually resulted in better ships being produced faster. Kapitän zur See Klaus Schultz, while analyzing captured American technical documents in February of 1944, prepared a report for U-Boat Command that detailed what he had discovered. Schultz reported that American escort carriers employed assembly techniques that should be theoretically impossible according to traditional naval architecture understanding. Entire sections of the ships, complete with installed equipment and electrical wiring, were prefabricated in different locations. These massive sections, weighing up to 200 tons each, were lifted by enormous cranes and welded together as complete units. A complete ship took shape in mere weeks rather than the months or years that would be required using traditional construction methods. Each vessel benefited from improvements and lessons learned during the construction of previous hulls, creating a continuous cycle of improvement. By March of 1944, the psychological transformation of the U-boat force was essentially complete. Crews that had once competed enthusiastically with each other for tonnage sunk, maintaining informal scoreboards and celebrating successful patrols, now celebrated the simple fact of mere survival. Morale had collapsed throughout the force as experienced crews came to recognize their true situation with growing clarity. With over 50 escort carriers now operational and additional carriers launching every few days, there was literally nowhere in the entire Atlantic Ocean that remained beyond the reach of carrier aircraft. The mid-Atlantic gap that had been the killing ground for Allied shipping had been completely closed by the mobile airfields that escort carriers represented. The stark numbers confirmed this transformation with brutal clarity. In May of 1943, before escort carriers had become fully operational in significant numbers, German U-boats had managed to sink 50 Allied merchant ships. By May of 1944, with over 60 escort carriers active across the Atlantic, Mediterranean and other theatres, U-boats managed to sink only 5 merchant ships while losing 25 submarines in the process. The exchange ratio had reversed so completely, so devastatingly, that Admiral Dönitz seriously considered suspending all U-boat operations entirely and recalling the submarines to port. USS Block Island exemplified the evolution and refinement of escort carrier tactics that had been developing through combat experience. Operating with 4 destroyer escorts in a coordinated hunter-killer group, Block Island pioneered night operations using radar-equipped Avenger aircraft that could hunt submarines in complete darkness. On the 29th of May in 1944, Block Island's aircraft located U-549 running on the surface during nighttime hours. The subsequent coordinated attack that developed demonstrated the precision that American doctrine had achieved. Aircraft maintained continuous contact with the submarine while simultaneously vectoring destroyers to its precise position. When U-549 executed a crash dive, acoustic sonobuoys tracked its underwater movement with precision. The submarine fought desperately in its death throes, managing to torpedo Block Island before being destroyed by depth charges. The loss of Block Island, which became one of only 6 escort carriers lost to enemy action during the entire war, actually illustrated American industrial supremacy rather than representing any German success. Block Island was replaced by 2 newly commissioned escort carriers within weeks of her sinking. Her experienced aircraft and aircrew were transferred to other carriers with barely a pause in overall operational tempo. Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz confronted this crushing reality directly during a staff conference held on the 2nd of June in 1944. The transcript of that conference, captured after the war, reveals his complete understanding of the situation his force faced. Dönitz stated that the enemy's small carriers had successfully eliminated every tactical advantage that U-boats had once possessed. U-boats could not operate on the surface during daylight hours due to aircraft. They could not operate on the surface during nighttime hours due to radar-equipped aircraft. The Americans, Dönitz concluded, had not defeated German submarines through superior tactics or superior seamanship. They had rendered submarines obsolete as an effective weapon through overwhelming presence and coverage. By August of 1944, the United States Navy operated 77 escort carriers with an additional 35 vessels under construction in various shipyards. These ships had transcended their original role as convoy defenders and had evolved into offensive weapons that could project power in ways that had not been originally anticipated. Operating off the European coast, escort carriers provided air support for the Normandy invasion and actively hunted U-boats in the Bay of Biscay. German coastal U-boat bases that had previously been immune to direct naval attack now faced carrier aircraft striking from beyond the range of land-based German fighters. The technical evolution of these vessels continued throughout 1944. The Commencement Bay class, larger and faster than the Casablanca-class vessels that had preceded them, began entering service in increasing numbers. These improved ships displaced 11,373 tons, fully loaded, and could achieve speeds of 19 knots, a meaningful improvement over earlier designs. Their flight decks stretched 553 feet in length. Each ship cost approximately $11 million to construct and required roughly 8 months to build from start to finish, still merely a fraction of the cost and time required for fleet carriers. German naval intelligence continued struggling to comprehend the industrial capacity that these production figures represented. Korvettenkapitän Ernst Herschagen, while analyzing American production capacity in September of 1944, prepared a detailed assessment that revealed his bewilderment. Each individual escort carrier required approximately 30,000 tons of steel, 2,000 miles of electrical cable, 50 miles of various piping, 80,000 separate blueprints, and 45,000 different components of various types. Yet despite this complexity, Americans were producing them with the same efficiency and speed as automobiles rolling off assembly lines. Herschagen noted that Seattle-Tacoma Shipbuilding alone had delivered 16 completed carriers during an 18-month period. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding USS Guadalcanal, achieved what might be considered the ultimate demonstration of escort carrier dominance on the 4th of June in 1944. His hunter-killer group successfully forced U-505 to the surface through depth charge attacks and then captured it intact, marking the first enemy warship captured at sea by the United States Navy since 1815. The submarine's seizure, accomplished with minimal casualties, demonstrated beyond any possible doubt that U-boats had transitioned from being predators into being prey. The statistical evidence documenting this transformation was simply overwhelming when examined comprehensively. During calendar year 1942, before escort carriers became operational in significant numbers, German U-boats had successfully sunk 1,160 Allied ships with a combined tonnage of 6,266,000 tons. During calendar year 1944, with escort carriers dominating every theatre where they operated, U-boats managed to sink only 132 ships totaling 773,000 tons, while simultaneously losing 249 submarines. German recognition of this catastrophic transformation appeared in unexpected places and contexts. Lieutenant zur See Hans Rudolf Rösing, who had been captured from U-846 in May of 1944, told his interrogators something that revealed the psychological impact. He stated that U-boat crews knew the war was lost when they simply counted American escort carriers and understood the implications. In 1943, he explained, they had laughed at these converted merchant ships. By 1944, they feared these vessels more than they feared battleships. A single escort carrier could clear an entire operational area of submarines simply through its presence. Total escort carrier production reached 151 ships by the war's conclusion, with 122 vessels constructed in the United States and 29 additional vessels built in Britain using American designs and components. These ships operated approximately 4,000 aircraft at peak operational strength, a number that exceeded the entire strength of the German Luftwaffe during 1944. The pilots who flew these aircraft, trained in programs that were producing 35,000 naval aviators annually through a vast training infrastructure, outnumbered total German U-boat crews by a factor of 3 to 1. Vice Admiral Lionel Wells, while analysing escort carrier effectiveness in a comprehensive post-war study, reached a conclusion that summarised their impact succinctly. The escort carrier program, Wells concluded, represented the perfect convergence of industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and strategic necessity occurring simultaneously. Americans built merchant ships that could launch aircraft, trained civilians to fly those aircraft, and fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare in the process. The human dimension of this transformation was captured powerfully in the interrogation records of Captain Lieutenant Wolfgang Haider, who had been captured from U-575 in March of 1944. Haider told his interrogators that American escort carriers had killed the U-boat force through sheer presence and persistence. They were everywhere, always. U-boat crews spent entire patrols submerged, seeing nothing, accomplishing nothing. Men went mad from the stress and isolation. Those little carriers that Americans built in mere weeks had destroyed the elite of German naval power more thoroughly than any enemy in history had managed. Admiral Royal Ingersoll, serving as Commander-in-Chief of the Atlantic Fleet, provided testimony to Congress in March of 1945 that offered an official assessment. The escort carrier program, Ingersoll stated, had succeeded beyond even the wildest expectations of its advocates. Initial planning had anticipated that these vessels would help protect convoys through their presence. Instead, they had eliminated the submarine threat entirely across vast areas of ocean. The Battle of the Atlantic was won, Ingersoll testified, not primarily by destroyers or patrol aircraft operating from land bases, but rather by these converted merchant ships that had been dismissed as inadequate by both German and some American naval officers. The German Navy's final formal assessment of the situation came from Gross Admiral Dönitz himself in his farewell address to the U-boat force delivered on the 4th of May in 1945 as Germany collapsed. Dönitz told the assembled U-boat crews that they had fought gallantly against overwhelming odds that no amount of skill or courage could overcome. The enemy's production of aircraft carriers, Dönitz stated, had made their struggle ultimately hopeless from the moment those carriers began operating in significant numbers. The Americans had built carriers faster than Germany could build submarines, trained pilots faster than Germany could train crews, and covered the ocean so completely that submarine operations became impossible. Comprehensive post-war analysis revealed the full scope and scale of what had been accomplished. American escort carriers flew over 460,000 combat sorties during the war years across all theatres. Their aircraft either sank directly or participated in sinking 53 German U-boats and 17 Japanese submarines. They provided essential air cover for every major amphibious operation conducted after 1943, from North Africa through Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and the Pacific Island campaigns. Despite their impressive operational record, only 6 American escort carriers were actually lost to enemy action during the entire war, a remarkably low loss rate. The Kaiser shipyards that had produced the majority of escort carriers became enduring symbols of American manufacturing power and capability. Workers who had never built ships before the war began, who in many cases had never even worked in heavy industry, were launching finished carriers at rates that peacetime professionals had declared impossible. Women comprised 27% of the workforce in these shipyards. African Americans accounted for another 15%. This diverse workforce, many members of which faced significant discrimination in civilian society, produced carriers that swept German submarines from the seas and fundamentally altered the course of the war. Captain Eric Brown, a distinguished British test pilot who flew aircraft from numerous American escort carriers during various operations, provided a valuable outside perspective on their significance. The Germans mocked these ships, Brown explained, because they fundamentally did not understand the revolution in warfare that these vessels represented. One escort carrier, examined in isolation, was vulnerable to attack and possessed obvious limitations. 50 escort carriers, operating as a coordinated fleet, were essentially invincible through their coverage and mutual support. The Americans grasped this principle immediately and intuitively. The Germans never understood it until far too late to matter. Fregattenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, who had been Germany's most successful U-boat ace before his capture in March of 1941, watched this entire transformation unfold from the perspective of a prisoner of war camp. Released after the war's conclusion, Kretschmer wrote extensively about what he had observed and learned. Germans, he reflected, had failed to understand that Americans approached warfare as fundamentally an industrial and production problem. While German strategists focused intensely on tactics and crew quality, believing these factors to be decisive, Americans instead focused on production capacity and coverage area. The escort carriers were not individually better ships than German vessels. They were the right ships produced in the right numbers for the strategic problem that needed to be solved. Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, a German U-boat veteran who had commanded the famous U-96, reflected on these events in 1975 with the perspective that 3 decades provided. The escort carriers, he stated, taught German submariners a fundamental lesson in humility. Germans had believed that warfare was primarily about warrior skill and superior tactical doctrine. The Americans demonstrated conclusively that modern warfare was actually about industrial capacity and systematic coverage. Those little carriers that German officers mocked so thoroughly represented something that German strategic thinking never understood, which was the American ability to transform virtually any problem into a production solution that could be solved through mass manufacturing. Rear Admiral Calvin Durgin, who had commanded multiple escort carrier task groups during combat operations, offered his own summary of what had been accomplished. Americans took basic merchant hulls, added flight decks and some aircraft, and changed naval history completely. The Germans laughed at these ships because they saw converted merchantmen and focused on individual vessel limitations. Americans saw mobile airfields that could be positioned anywhere and provide coverage at any time. Germans counted ships as individual units. Americans counted coverage area and persistence. This fundamental difference in perspective determined the war's outcome in the Atlantic. A final irony worth noting emerged from reports of conversations during the war's final days. In April of 1945, Adolf Hitler reportedly asked Admiral Dönitz directly why the U-boats were failing so completely to achieve results. Dönitz explained about the American escort carriers and their impact on submarine operations. Hitler allegedly responded by asking why Germany had not built similar vessels. Dönitz's reported reply was brutally honest. Germany had not built such vessels because Germany could not build one completed carrier per week as the Americans were doing. Hitler reportedly had no response to this statement of industrial reality. By the 8th of May in 1945, when Germany formally surrendered, the United States Navy operated 105 escort carriers with additional vessels still under construction in various shipyards. These ships had effectively transformed the Atlantic into what could be accurately described as an Allied lake. The U-boat force that had nearly succeeded in starving Britain through its offensive against shipping found itself starved of operational space. Many U-boats commissioned late in the war never fired a torpedo in anger during their entire careers, spending their operational lives hiding from carrier aircraft that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. Statistical analysis conducted after the war confirmed the magnitude of this transformation with mathematical precision. In calendar year 1942, an individual U-boat had approximately a 75% probability of returning safely from its patrol. By early 1945, that survival rate had plummeted to merely 25%. The primary cause of this catastrophic increase in losses was aircraft, predominantly operating from escort carriers. Of the 40,000 German sailors who served in U-boats during the war, 30,000 died in action, representing a casualty rate of 75% that exceeded almost any other military service in any nation. The majority of these men died after escort carriers made submarine operations essentially suicidal. These highly trained, courageous men were sacrificed to a fundamental strategic misconception that American industrial capacity could not overcome German tactical expertise. Commander George Chamberlain, who had served aboard USS Guadalcanal during its most successful patrols, offered a perspective that acknowledged both sides. Americans were not better sailors than the Germans, Chamberlain stated clearly. German U-boat crews were incredibly brave and remarkably skilled professionals. But Americans had access to seemingly endless carriers with endless aircraft. For every submarine Germany constructed, America countered with a carrier that could hunt that submarine across vast areas of ocean. It was not fair to the German submariners. It was not supposed to be fair. It was supposed to be effective. The complete escort carrier program cost approximately $1.5 billion in 1940s currency values. This investment successfully destroyed German U-boat effectiveness while saving countless Allied merchant ships and the supplies they carried. Each escort carrier cost approximately $7 million to construct and could protect convoys worth hundreds of millions of dollars in cargo while destroying submarines that cost millions to build and years to crew with trained personnel. Workers at the Kaiser shipyards expressed justifiable pride in their achievements. Rosie Devlin, a welder who worked on 12 different escort carriers during her wartime service, offered a representative comment. Workers knew these ships were not aesthetically beautiful. They were basic and simple in design. But workers also knew these vessels worked effectively. Every carrier launched meant that convoys would arrive safely at their destinations. Shipyard workers were fighting the war with rivet guns and welding torches rather than rifles and torpedoes. The final accounting of the escort carrier program's impact was stark and undeniable. Germany began the war with 57 operational U-boats and constructed 1,162 additional submarines during the war years. They lost 785 U-boats total, with 632 lost to Allied action. Approximately 175 were destroyed either directly by escort carrier aircraft or by hunter-killer groups centered on escort carriers. Considering that escort carriers only became fully operational in significant numbers starting in mid-1943, this represented extraordinary effectiveness in a relatively brief operational period. Starting with 0 escort carriers in 1941, the United States constructed 151 vessels by 1945. These ships operated approximately 4,500 aircraft at peak operational strength. They flew over 460,000 combat sorties and fundamentally changed the nature of naval warfare while maintaining an operational availability rate exceeding 80% throughout their service. Herbert Werner, a German U-boat commander who was among the very few to survive the entire war from beginning to end, provided perhaps the most succinct summary from the German perspective. The escort carriers killed German submarines through superior presence rather than superior technology or tactics. Individual U-boats could avoid individual ships through skill and experience, but they could not avoid systematic coverage that eventually encompassed the entire ocean. Every carrier the Americans launched effectively shrunk U-boat operational areas until finally submarines had nowhere to go except down to the ocean floor permanently. The transformation from German contempt to German despair occurred in less than 18 months, a remarkably compressed timeline. This rapid reversal demonstrated clearly that industrial warfare operated according to different timescales than traditional military planning and doctrine anticipated. While Germany slowly and painstakingly improved submarine technology through incremental advances, America rapidly multiplied carrier production through industrial techniques. The German response to this reality, found preserved in captured Kriegsmarine archives, ultimately was resignation and acceptance. The American escort carrier program succeeded through what could only be described as brute industrial force applied systematically. Americans built carriers faster than Germany could sink them, trained pilots faster than Germany could shoot them down, and deployed coverage faster than Germany could develop countermeasures. Germans were defeated not by better warriors or superior tactics, but by superior factories and production systems. The escort carriers that German admirals examined with such contempt and laughter in May of 1943 had, by May of 1945, transformed the Atlantic Ocean from a U-boat hunting ground into an Allied controlled lake. These converted merchant ships accomplished what the Royal Navy's destroyers alone could not achieve, which was the complete suppression of the submarine threat through overwhelming and continuous presence. The German admirals who laughed at photographs of escort carriers in 1943 lived, those who survived the war, to witness these same vessels accepting U-boat surrenders in 1945. The complete transformation required less than 2 years to accomplish. During that remarkably brief period, American industrial capacity rewrote fundamental rules of naval warfare that had existed for centuries. The story concludes where it began, with German naval officers examining photographs and intelligence reports about American escort carriers. But instead of laughing at what they perceived as crude construction and desperate improvisation, these officers stood in silence, finally understanding that these simple ships, these converted merchant vessels that seemed so inadequate, had destroyed the U-boat force more completely and thoroughly than any enemy in maritime history had ever accomplished. American industrial might, applied with systematic determination, had transformed maritime warfare forever in ways that would influence naval doctrine for generations. The final testimony regarding escort carriers came from Gross Admiral Dönitz himself, speaking to his remaining staff officers as Germany surrendered unconditionally. Germans lost the Battle of the Atlantic, Dönitz stated with brutal honesty, not due to inferior seamanship or inadequate courage, but rather due to inferior arithmetic and industrial capacity. The Americans built escort carriers at a pace faster than German strategists could even comprehend, much less counter effectively. Germans thought warfare was fundamentally about warriors and their skills. Americans understood that modern warfare was actually about production capacity and systematic application of resources. Germans were wrong in their assumptions. Americans were correct in their understanding. That fundamental difference in perspective, Dönitz concluded, explained why Germany lost the Atlantic campaign and ultimately the war itself.